All right, let's continue with Canada and the Gilded Age. We're calling this expansion, this first phase, expansion and disappointment, because those are the two things that are alternately occurring. Now, the Canadian Pacific Railway had been given a monopoly to induce its builders to build it. So people in the West had no option. Its parallel in the East, the Intercolonial Railway, was owned and operated by the government, and it provided rewards and employment patronage to government supporters. So both the CPR and the Intercolonial, however, gave money to the party in power, which could then disperse it in the form of favors or bribes as it saw fit. This corrupt system, with the government holding a lock on rail travel more or less, would become a major political issue. The railways did more than traverse the Canadian wilderness. They opened it for business, assisted by the simultaneous development of electricity in the 1880s. The age of steam was supplemented rather than replaced by the age of electricity. Coal, distant and costly, though abundant, was replaced as far as central Canada was concerned by hydroelectric power from the rapids and waterfalls of Ontario and Quebec's rivers. Think about Niagara Falls. In northern Ontario and Quebec, electricity and abundant water made possible lumber mills and then pulp and paper factories in the midst of the ancient forest. Crews blasting rock out of the railway lines discovered nickel near Sudbury. A huge nickel mine soon followed. Now, the governments actively meddled in the economy. Agriculture was Canada's most important industry, and most Canadians depended directly or indirectly on farming. The federal government developed experimental farms to assist agricultural productivity and spread farming to areas previously considered too cold or too dry to attempt farming. The provinces dabbled in agricultural education. A federal geological survey, founded before Confederation, explored Canada's subterranean geography and published its findings. The government subsidized railways to accomplish public purposes, built canals and docks, and dredged rivers and harbors. So government played a big role in economic development in the Gilded Age in Canada. To what degree did this differ with the U.S.? Ask me about that in class. All right, in cities, department stores drew out of dry goods shops or general stores or fur trading posts, elaborate new department stores, Eaton's and Simpson's in Toronto, Morgan's and Dupuis Frere in Montreal, and eventually the Hudson's Bay Company and Woodward's in Vancouver. Large, attractive, multi-story retail palaces appeared in the downtowns of larger cities, which customers could reach using horse-drawn streetcars and later electric streetcars. But advances in merchandising weren't confined to the cities. As the railways made reliable supply and customer deliveries possible, some of the department stores established a catalog sales business from large central warehouses, relying on the mail for delivery. Here we see Dupuis Frere's catalog cover. Now, trade unions had existed in Canada prior to the Gilded Age. The same was true of Britain. That's where they came from. The same was true in the U.S. These unions expanded during the Gilded Age, based more in Canada, however, on the American rather than the British model, on British organizations. For example, if you're a printer in Canada, you might belong to the National Typographical Union, which is part of a U.S. syndicate because you'd move back and forth across the border. So it was more based on really American models than Britain. Employers were not charmed by the emergence of unions, obviously, none less so than George Brown, the very imperious owner of the Toronto Globe. Brown's confrontations with labor dated back to the 1850s and lasted all his life, which was terminated when he was shot in the leg by a disgruntled ex-employee in 1880. Sir John Macdonald, Brown's great political rival, further irritated the newspapermen by passing legislation regularizing and legalizing union status in 1872. That's significant. Other regulations, however, were much slower in coming. Things did eventually improve, but it was the rather difficult position of labor in Canada gave Canada the reputation of being socially and economically very conservative. Local, national, international unions faced an uphill battle in Canada. They could organize, collect dues, and go on strike, but employers could respond by hiring replacements. Riots frequently resulted, which in turn gave employment to the local militia. Whether the militia gave satisfaction to those who called them out was another question. Also, ask me in class about this, and let's compare it to the American story. Labor was not necessarily a giant unified political bloc. Tariffs were a major political issue, and they protected employers and therefore bought votes for the Conservative Party of Sir John Macdonald from workers because it protected their jobs as well. Canadian governments would have preferred to return to lower tariffs with the United States to spur trade, but realized this was an unrealizable ambition. There remained the domestic market and the politics that surrounded it. Political advantage dictated a high tariff policy whose benefits were on display in the neighboring United States, whose tariffs were an invisible cement binding manufacturers to the high tariff Republican Party. And clearly it resulted in huge growth there. The convergence of interests was veiled in nationalism, assuring voters that it was patriotic to support high tariffs. Macdonald saw no reason not to imitate the Republicans in the U.S. He called his tariff regime the national policy. Inaugurated in 1879, it remained the basis of Canada's commercial policy for the next 100 years. There were, however, flirtations with departing from this national policy. Many Canadians were troubled by their country's lagging economy, Canada's slow growth, the unwitting provincialism of its politics, and the relative lack of prosperity and opportunity compared with the United States persuaded some to seek a broader union with the Republic. The most prominent proponent of this view was a guy named Godwin Smith, who was a former professor at the universities of Oxford and Cornell. And in the 1880s, he took up residence in Toronto and kind of became a gadfly. He annoyed politicians, but he got away. He was immune from local pressures because of his wife's money. And he wrote boldly of the failure of the Canadian experiment and urged annexation to the United States because it was assumed that the U.S. would only trade with Canada at the expense of annexation. Now, Laurier, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, had emerged as the leader of the Liberal Party, and he had an idea running an election in 1891. He thought, hey, why don't the Liberals stand for unrestricted reciprocity with the United States? That will distinguish us from the Conservatives, and people want to be more prosperous and trade with the U.S. But politics trumped economics. Sir John Macdonald played the loyalty card, implying the Liberals were at best a pack of fools and at worst villains and traitors. He proclaimed, "A British subject I was born, a British subject I will die," linking this idea of unrestricted reciprocity to annexation with the U.S. And so Laurier failed and wondered what happened, and he drew the right conclusion. Tampering with Canada's British identity was political poison. He would never, ever do that again. Now, the last great political issue of the 19th century was a religious one, the Manitoba Schools question. Education was a provincial matter, and all provinces supported schools through taxation. In Ontario and Quebec, public, effectively Protestant, and Catholic systems coexisted, embedded in the Constitution and beyond the ability of the local religious majorities to alter. Manitoba's Constitution reflected the original balance between English and French speakers, and between Catholic and Protestant. French was officially sanctioned, and there was a separate Catholic school system. Elsewhere, outside these three provinces, the Catholic minority depended on the tolerance of the Protestant majority to fence off segments of the school system for Catholic education. Language practices were similarly a matter of grace, basically, in favor, because except in Quebec, Manitoba, and the federal parliament and courts, there was no right to use French. Now, Catholic and French patience was tried by the actions of the Manitoba government. In the 1880s, the province had filled up with Anglo-Ontarian settlers, while the proportion of French speakers steadily declined. The provincial election of 1888 ratified this demographic fact, and the Liberals, under a guy named Thomas Greenway, took power and promptly moved to abolish both the official status of French and separate schools. The British North America Act had provided for such an eventuality. The federal parliament had the right to pass legislation to remedy the grievances of the minority in Manitoba. And eventually the Conservative government in Ottawa nerved itself to do just that. By the time it did, however, in 1896, the Conservatives were on the brink of losing power. In this 1896 election, a guy named Tupper, Sir Charles Tupper, Macdonald was dead now, led the Conservatives, and Laurier opposed him. The Conservatives had protected the rights of the Manitoba French, Laurier's position was impossible to discern. Nevertheless, Laurier recommended The sunny ways of conciliation is the key to an amicable solution. And amazingly, Quebec went along with this, presumably because he was French. And so he is elected in 1896, Laurier is, and will remain the PM for the next 15 years.